What does it take to turn a family home into a crime scene? A quiet suburban street, a teenager with a bright future, and a mother who would do anything for her daughter. On the surface, it seemed like an ordinary life, but on one March afternoon, a sound shattered the calm. A secret long buried had erupted in the most unimaginable way. In the days that followed, investigators would uncover chilling clues: a locked room, a missing camera, and a journal filled with words that no parent would ever want to read. What drove a 15-year-old girl to cross a line most of us couldn't fathom? And was it something she always carried with her? Or something that was bound to happen? This is the story of Carly Gregg, a case that forces us to ask, how well can we ever really know someone? Welcome to True Crime Theatre HQ. For more stories like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because you won't want to miss what happens next. To everyone who knew her, Carly Gregg was a star in the making. With sharp intelligence and a smile that could light up a room, she was the kind of child every parent dreams of raising. For her mother, Ashley, Carly wasn't just a daughter. She was her purpose, her anchor, the one bright constant in an otherwise turbulent life. But what happens when a foundation built on love begins to crack? When devotion alone isn't enough to hold back the weight of the past? Ashley had seen more than her share of pain. Long before she became the picture of a devoted mother, she had survived a nightmare. A volatile marriage to Carly's biological father. He wasn't just distant, he was unpredictable, driven by demons he could never seem to outrun. Mental illness, addiction, and flashes of rage haunted their household. Ashley bore the brunt of it, shielding Carly from his outbursts as best she could. And when the bruises on her arms became too much to ignore, she packed up her life and her daughter, fleeing into the night to start over. It wasn't easy, but Ashley was determined to build a new life for Carly. In time, she remarried, finding a steady presence in Heath Smiley, a man who promised the stability Ashley had so desperately sought. Together, they created a home where, for a while, it seemed like the shadows of the past might finally fade away. But wounds like that don't heal easily. Carly grew up knowing her father's legacy, haunted by questions she couldn't answer. Would she inherit his struggles? Was his darkness a part of her, too? These thoughts were whispered fears that no one dared say aloud. Not Ashley, not Heath, and certainly not Carly. And yet they lingered, silent and heavy, as the years passed. He looked west, staring at his own backyard, and stared and pessimism in his soul. It was a house that on the surface seemed filled with love and second chances. But beneath the warm smiles and family dinners, tensions simmered. And no one, not Ashley, not Heath, not anyone, could have predicted how far those tensions would go. What happens when love isn't enough to erase the scars of the past? For Ashley, it meant clinging to hope, to the belief that she could protect Carly from her own history. For Carly, it meant walking a path where choices would lead to a moment no one could ever take back. In her younger years, Carly Gregg had been a model student, the kind of child teachers and parents would point to with pride. She was sharp, curious, and driven, a standout in her class, even earning a coveted Student of the Year award as a freshman. But as the years went by, the bright young girl everyone thought they knew began to change. And the transformation wasn't gradual. It was as if a shadow crept in overnight, reshaping Carly in ways that would leave her family and friends stunned. By her sophomore year, Carly was no longer the girl who stayed late after class to help her teachers or spent her evenings studying. Instead, she was slipping into behaviors that Ashley couldn't ignore. She started vaping, smoking marijuana, and disappearing into long, hushed conversations on burner phones that Ashley had no idea existed. These weren't the actions of a rebellious teen experimenting with boundaries. There was something else at play, something far more unsettling. It wasn't just her actions that changed, it was her demeanor. Carly grew distant, retreating into herself and spending hours alone in her room. When Ashley stumbled upon Carly's journal one day, what she found would haunt her. The pages were filled with dark, cryptic thoughts that seemed to come from someone unrecognizable. Phrases like, "You don't need a family," and "It's okay to be evil," were scrawled across the pages, stark confessions that painted a portrait of a mind struggling to find its balance. Ashley didn't know what to do. She tried to connect with Carly, asking questions, offering support, even jokingly asking if her daughter was going through an identity crisis when Carly chopped off her long blonde hair. But every attempt was met with a wall, a silent refusal to let her mother in. In private, Ashley began to piece together the fragments of her daughter's life. She found vape pens hidden in drawers, noticed the way Carly's eyes seemed heavy and unfocused after long nights in her room, and started to question what else she might be missing. But Carly wasn't just hiding things, she was creating an entirely separate world for herself. One Ashley could only glimpse through the cracks, and then there were the journals. More than just private thoughts, they were a window into a psyche unraveling. Carly wrote about fire, calling it powerful, beautiful, and deadly. She questioned everything her mother had ever taught her, rejecting ideas of morality, love, and even the existence of a higher power. These weren't the ramblings of a confused teenager. They were declarations from someone grappling with forces they couldn't understand, or perhaps didn't want to. For Ashley, it was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Her once proclaimed daughter was slipping away, and every attempt to reach out seemed to push Carly further into the darkness. What Ashley didn't know was how close that darkness was to consuming them both. March 19, 2024 began like any other day. The sun rose over the quiet Mississippi neighborhood where Ashley Smiley lived with her teenage daughter, Carly. They drove to school together just as they had done countless times before. Ashley taught math, Carly attended her classes, and the day unfolded with the same rhythm it always had. But neither of them knew that by sundown, their lives would be changed forever. It started with a discovery. That afternoon, as they returned home, Ashley walked into Carly's room. She wasn't looking for trouble, just tidying up, perhaps the way parents often do. But then she found them. The vape pens, hidden in a drawer. It wasn't the first time Ashley had caught glimpses of Carly's secret world. But this discovery made something snap. As Carly let the dogs out into the backyard, Ashley took the vape pens to her room and returned to search for more evidence of her daughter's behavior. She was determined to confront Carly, to finally take control of a situation she feared was spiraling beyond her grasp. When Carly came back inside, the confrontation began. We'll never know exactly what was said between mother and daughter in those final moments, but what happened next is devastatingly clear. Carly walked to her mother's bedroom, not to talk, but with purpose. She knew exactly where her stepfather kept his revolver, a loaded .357 Magnum tucked beneath the mattress. Without hesitation, she took it, concealing it behind her back as she moved through the house. The next moments unfolded in eerie silence. Carly stepped into her own room, where her mother was still searching, perhaps too focused on her task to sense the danger creeping up behind her. And then, 3 deafening gunshots shattered the stillness of the house. Each shot was deliberate, each one sealing Ashley's fate. What came next was cold and calculated. Carly wasn't panicked or remorseful. Instead, she began methodically covering her tracks. She removed the home security camera, hiding it in the refrigerator, as if erasing evidence would erase what had just happened. She took her mother's phone and began texting, crafting messages meant to make it seem like Ashley was still alive. One message went to her stepfather, Heath Smiley, addressing him with an affectionate "honey," asking when he would be home. Carly then texted friends, one of whom arrived at the house shortly after. But what that friend found would haunt them forever. Carly led them to her bedroom, where Ashley's lifeless body lay on the floor, her arms crossed over her chest and a cloth draped over her face. Carly spoke as if in a trance, mentioning the revolver and the rounds she had left, even hinting that her stepfather would be next. The friend fled the house in terror, leaving Carly alone with the weight of her actions. When Heath arrived home minutes later, he walked into a nightmare. Carly was waiting for him. As he opened the door, another gunshot rang out, grazing his shoulder. But Heath fought back, wresting the revolver from Carly's hands as she screamed and fled into the backyard. From there, she disappeared into the woods, leaving Heath bleeding and in shock. He managed to call 911. 911 responded, as their injured, wounded comrade rescued his daughter, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what had just happened in what had always been a safe and loving home. By the time law enforcement arrived, the house had become a crime scene. Ashley was gone, Heath was wounded, and Carly was on the run. But her attempt to escape justice wouldn't last long. Police found her less than a mile away, disoriented and defiant, the weight of her actions yet to fully register. March 19, 2024 would be remembered not as an ordinary day, but as the day Carly Gregg crossed an unimaginable line, leaving a family shattered and a community searching for answers. The house that had once been a sanctuary was now a scene of chaos. Heath Smiley's voice trembled as he spoke to the 911 operator, struggling to make sense of the horror he had walked into. "She's gone," he said, his words fragmented by shock. He explained how his stepdaughter Carly had pointed a loaded gun at him, how he had narrowly avoided death, and how she had fled into the woods moments before. In the darkness outside, Carly ran. The forest that bordered their home seemed like her only refuge, a place to hide from the flashing lights and the sirens that would soon converge on the house. She wasn't just running from the police. She was running from the irreversible decisions she had made, from the mother she had left lifeless, and from the family she had destroyed. Back at the house, officers arrived to find Heath bleeding but alive. As EMTs treated his wounds, investigators entered the home. What they discovered was more than a crime. It was an unraveling of a story no one wanted to believe. In Carly's bedroom, Ashley's body lay on the floor, her face carefully covered by a cloth, as if in some twisted attempt at dignity. But no detail, no cover-up, could hide the truth. The evidence was everywhere. The missing security camera, the frantic text messages sent from Ashley's phone, and the loaded revolver left on the kitchen counter with one round still in the chamber. While investigators processed the scene, a search team fanned out into the woods. Flashlights pierced through the dense trees, casting long, shifting shadows. Carly had left a trail, not just in her haste to escape, but in the choices she had made that led to this moment. It didn't take long for officers to find her. Less than a mile from the house, she was cornered, her escape brought to an abrupt end. Handcuffs clicked around her wrists, and the teenager who had once been a bright student with endless potential was now a suspect in her mother's murder. Even in custody, Carly remained an enigma. Her emotions shifted wildly. Moments of apparent detachment gave way to flashes of distress, but there was no undoing what had happened. The evidence was overwhelming, and the questions surrounding her motives only deepened. What had driven her to commit such an unthinkable act? Was this the result of a fractured mind, or had Carly been fully aware of what she was doing? A small Mississippi community was left reeling, unable to reconcile the smiling girl they had known with the cold, calculated actions that had taken place inside her home. For Ashley's family, the grief was compounded by the horrifying realization that it was her own daughter who had pulled the trigger. And for Heath Smiley, the man who had tried to create a safe haven for his stepdaughter, the betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. The aftermath of March 19, 2024 wasn't just the end of one life. It was the unraveling of many. Carly's attempt to flee may have failed, but the questions her actions left behind would linger far longer than her time in the woods. The story wasn't over. In truth, it was just beginning. The courtroom was heavy with tension as the trial of Carly Gregg began. Family members, friends, and curious onlookers filled the gallery, all struggling to make sense of the tragedy that had unfolded. At the center of it all was Carly, a 15-year-old girl who had gone from an honor student to an accused killer. Was she a victim of her own unraveling mind, or had she knowingly plotted her mother's murder? The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They painted a picture of cold calculation, pointing to the chilling details of Carly's actions: the deliberate retrieval of the .357 Magnum, the removal of the security camera, and the texts sent from her mother's phone. Each step, they argued, was evidence of premeditation. And then there were the journal entries. Words like, "You don't need family," and "It's okay to be evil" loomed large, casting a shadow over the defense's claim of a broken mind. To the prosecution, these weren't just private thoughts. They were declarations of intent. This was no accident, the prosecutor told the jury. Carly Gregg knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just lashing out, she was planning, and she followed through, knowing the consequences. The words echoed in the silent courtroom as jurors glanced at the notebooks spread before them, the damning phrases highlighted in bold strokes. But the defense had a very different story to tell. Carly's attorney stepped forward, describing a girl who had been spiraling under the weight of undiagnosed mental illness. They spoke of Carly's depression, her anxiety, and the auditory hallucinations she had written about in her journal. Carly wasn't herself, her attorney argued. She was a child in crisis, a girl overwhelmed by a mind that was turning against her. And to support their case, the defense called psychiatrist Dr. Andrew Clark to the stand. He testified about Carly's deteriorating mental state, pointing to her struggles with bipolar disorder and her erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the incident. The switch from Zoloft to Lexapro just days before the tragedy was a critical factor, Dr. Clark explained. Such changes can cause extreme mood swings, intensifying feelings of hopelessness and desperation. His words painted a portrait of a girl who was more lost than malicious. The emotional weight of the trial was perhaps best captured by Heath Smiley's testimony. The man who had nearly died at Carly's hands took the stand, not to condemn her, but to plead for understanding. "Carly loved her mother," Heath said, his voice breaking, "and Ashley loved her more than anything in this world. What happened that day, it wasn't Carly. It wasn't the girl we knew." His unwavering support for the girl who had shattered his family left many in the courtroom stunned. As the days wore on, the battle between the prosecution and the defense became a war of narratives. Was Carly Gregg a dangerous and calculated killer, or was she a deeply troubled teenager who had lost her way? The jurors sat quietly, their expressions unreadable, as each side presented its closing arguments. When the trial finally concluded, one truth remained. There were no easy answers. The fate of Carly Gregg now rested in the hands of 12 strangers, tasked with unraveling a web of lies, truth, and tragedy. And as the jury retired to deliberate, the question lingered in the air. Would they see Carly as a victim or as a monster? The room fell silent as the jury filed back into the courtroom. All eyes were on them, each step echoing with the weight of what they were about to announce. Carly Gregg sat motionless at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale. This was the moment that would decide her fate, the culmination of months of heartbreak, scrutiny, and unanswered questions. The judge's voice broke the stillness. Has the jury reached a verdict? A single juror stood, her expression solemn as she handed the folded paper to the bailiff. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the judge read the decision aloud. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of attempted murder, guilty of tampering with evidence. The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Carly's reaction was immediate. Her shoulders shook and tears streamed down her face as the reality of her sentence set in. But there would be no reprieve. As the judge continued, the punishment became clear. 2 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole, and an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence. For Carly Gregg, there would be no second chances, no opportunity to rewrite her story. In the gallery, Ashley's family sat in stunned silence. Heath Smiley, the man who had fought for Carly in court despite her actions, bowed his head. The weight of the verdict pressed down on everyone in the room. And yet, there was no sense of relief, no closure, only the haunting question of what could have been. Months earlier, Carly's defense team had been offered a plea deal, 40 years in prison in exchange for avoiding trial. At the time, it seemed like an impossible choice. But now, as the judge's gavel fell, that deal loomed large. A missed opportunity that might have spared Carly a lifetime behind bars. As the courtroom emptied, the pain lingered. For Ashley's family, the loss was immeasurable, a daughter and mother gone forever. For Heath, the betrayal of a girl he had loved and raised as his own cut deeper than any physical wound. And for Carly, the young woman at the heart of it all. The future was nothing more than the stark walls of a prison cell. Justice had been served, or so the court believed. But in the end, there were no winners, only scars that would remain long after the verdict was read. September 20, 2024 marked the end of a trial but the beginning of a lifelong reckoning for everyone involved. In the end, the answers remain as elusive as the questions are haunting. A flickering candle, a loaded revolver, a life extinguished by a choice that can never be undone. As investigators slipped the weapon into an evidence bag, they weren't just handling a piece of metal. They were holding the symbol of a family shattered beyond repair. In Carly's own words, scrawled across the pages of her journal, she wrote, "I choose fire. It's powerful, beautiful, and deadly." Words that now feel like a prophecy fulfilled. But why does someone make that choice? What leads a bright young girl to cross a line that no one can ever step back from? This case forces us to confront the darker corners of the human condition. The frailty of mental health, the weight of generational scars, and the cracks in the systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Carly Gregg wasn't a monster from a crime novel. She was a teenager, a daughter, a person. And yet, her choices left devastation in their wake. What makes someone choose fire? And more importantly, what can we do to ensure it doesn't happen again? The answers aren't simple, but the questions demand our attention. For more stories that illuminate the darkest truths, subscribe to True Crime Theatre HQ and hit the notification bell. Because sometimes, the truth isn't just stranger than fiction, it's far more chilling.